Equity, mate.
I will say this about investing. Everything you do learn is cumulative. What I learned at 20 is useful.
Welcome back to another episode of Equity Mates. Now, Ren, I normally do my weird and wonderful intro thanks to ChatGPT, but we've just come off a fascinating interview, so we've rolled straight into doing the intros, and I don't have it in front of me.
That's all right. That's all right.
But welcome.
You know what? We don't need a weird and wonderful intro because what the topic of this interview is weird and wonderful enough.
That is very true.
De-extinction.
Yes, what an interview. This isn't hardcore investing or business, but it is a fascinating founder entrepreneurship story, and one that is in a field that, if it pays off and comes to fruition, oh my God, we're going to see woolly mammoths walking around.
Yeah. So Colossal Biosciences is the company, and we're speaking to the co-founder and CEO, Ben Lamm. Colossal have got a colossal task in front of them. They've set themselves a big goal. They want to bring back from extinction the woolly mammoth, the Tasmanian tiger, aka the thylacine, and the dodo. And that's just where they're starting.
Yeah, it's nuts.
So we speak to Ben about his journey because he, in case what he's doing now wasn't enough, he's also founded and exited 5 companies before this. So he is the definition of a serial entrepreneur. But then we get into the task at hand with Colossal Biosciences, the founding story and where they are on that journey. And the really exciting thing is that Ben is actually coming to Australia. He's going to be in Sydney soon for South by Southwest Sydney.
Yes, so South by Southwest, if you haven't heard of it before, it's the world's most iconic future-focused conference and festival, hence why we have people like Ben speaking. So it's going to be held here in Sydney, the first time that it is held outside Texas, here in Sydney from Sunday, October 15th through to Sunday, October 22nd, 2023. Key content pillars include tech and innovation, games, music, screen and culture. It is going to be a jam-packed week of programming. Now, if you're interested in grabbing a ticket, you do need a wristband or a badge to attend. Head to sxswsydney.com to secure yours. That's sxswsydney.com.
Yeah, so we'll include a link in the show notes for this. But Bryce, before we get into it, I just want to make the call that in our book, Don't Stress, Just Invest, we actually wrote about Colossal Biosciences. And if you're wondering why there's a connection between this company and our investing book, well, you're going to have to pick up the book, available in all good bookstores. I'm not saying that what we wrote in the book had anything to do with us getting Ben for this interview, but I'm not saying it didn't have anything either.
Okay, sure.
But yeah, anyway, before we keep rambling, let's get to this interview because it is absolutely fascinating.
Well, Ben, a massive welcome to Equity Mates. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So to kick things off and to warm us up, I've got a would you rather question. Would you rather go into the past and meet your ancestors or go into the future and meet your great-great-grandchildren?
I'd love to go into the future and see if I pulled some of these things off.
Yeah, fair call.
So they either like me or not.
Yeah. Well, we will get into what you're trying to pull off because it is fascinating. But Ben, before we get to the work that you're doing today at Colossal Biosciences, we want to start with you because you've had a fascinating career. When we were researching you before this interview, we could count 5 companies that you founded and exited. It could be more, but there were 5 that we could find. So we would love to start by hearing your journey in your own words. Can you introduce yourself and I guess your career to date to us?
Yeah, I think 5 is right.
Must be nice.
I feel like I'm 190 years old, right? Because it's like startup life is not easy, to say the least. So it's like that was people were like, I'm like, that was a lifetime ago. They were like, that was like 7 years ago. Wait, what? That seems like 100 years ago. But no, I'm Ben. I'm one of the co-founders of George Church and CEO of Colossal Biosciences, what I believe is the world's first de-extinction company, which sounds like we'll talk about in a little bit. And my journey has always just been one, I guess, of the entrepreneurial struggle. where I work with much smarter women and men than me to work on really interesting problems. I've always been fascinated with kind of what I would say is like the next thing. And, I went to school for finance and accounting, and I realized that was not for me. I wanted to do something that's more interesting. And I saw an opportunity to get into e-learning and kind of, play a role in how corporate America and corporations around the world trained their next generation. Like, how could we, we coined this term called edutainment, where it's like, how can we build something that's really educational and entertaining, and hopefully get people to, if they're going to have to do training, how can we do it in a way that people actually, care? And so started a company in that category. And then there was like the iPhone. I joked like, you don't want an iPhone, don't touch one, right? Because like the minute I touched an iPhone, I was like, shit, I gotta buy one. And then I thought, well, there was a blossoming app ecosystem. So I kind of thought, I would move from training to software development and build apps for large corporations. And then I was like, well, there's a huge opportunity here to build gaming. So then we moved into it. We built a gaming platform after that, ended up getting acquired by Zynga. And yeah, and in the journey, it's just like, it's been interesting. Like along the path, I just keep meeting really incredibly smart people. One of my co-founders, everyone now knows what conversational OS is and what LLMs are. We started a company called Conversable, and we're about 5 years too early and $45 billion off of and so OpenAI and large language models are now the thing. And we were saying that in 2016 and no one listened. But we started one of the first conversational AI companies out there, and it was great. It was still, not $45 billion great, but ended up building a lot of really cool conversational AI driven interfaces for, Disney and Whole Foods and Pizza Hut and all these really cool brands. And so, one of the things I think you'll notice about the journey is it's kind of like, what are interesting technologies that we think could be better leveraged through software and through innovation? Fast forward, 5 years, we built one of the leading common operating pictures, which is like a command and control module that help enable everyone from like large enterprises and energy trading companies that could really monitor what was going on in the grid, leveraging AI, to applying that same technology to NORAD, Northcom, and some of the systems that drive intelligent awareness of what's going on in the skies. And then that was further used in homeland security and a few other things. And so it became this dynamic command and control platform that was pretty helpful to the U.S. and some of its allies, and with integrated with some of the pieces of that integrated in space. And that, so once again, didn't know much about it, but it was interesting, and we thought it was a cool sector. And then along the way, I met George Church, and I like pre-pandemic, I had a pretty good, like Hypergiant of the things I'd worked on was pretty cool. We were doing interesting things in space. We'd go to NASA, we'd go to the Pentagon, we'd have dinner with Bill Nye. It really wasn't the worst. And it's hard stuff, and there were definitely painful days. But then I met George Church because I thought, well, maybe the next could be synthetic biology. Could we build software in synthetic biology and leverage AI in biology? That seems interesting. Seems like all these CRISPR-like tools could be used to make interesting things. And so I got my answer from George in like 6 seconds on my call with him, because he's just so smart. And then I'm curious, and I think that probably has been another theme of my life. And I asked George, what else you got? Like, what else are you doing? And he talked about regenerative neurons and all these different things that were just crazy. But then he had to go. It was like towards the end of the call, and he's like, oh, and by the way, I'm also working to bring back the woolly mammoth and de-extinct species and use those technologies for conservation and also to repopulate, broken ecosystems and save the world. And I was like, and he's like, I have to go. And I was like, wait, what? At the time, I think I was like 38, 39. I was like, that was the greatest thing anyone's ever said to me. And he just hung up. And I sat there just like dumbfounded that, like, I got to talk to this like industry luminary, George Church, and like the OG of OGs of both synthetic biology and genetic engineering, and was like, you just said the greatest thing to me ever. And like, was that a joke? Like, I remember the moment like vividly. I was like at my home office and I just like, that's the weirdest thing that's ever happened to me. And all night long, I stayed up, I read articles and interviews and watched like CNN and 60 Minutes and all these different things that George had done. And there was this mammoth through line. So he like really believed it. And so the next day I got him back on the phone and I asked him if I could come see his lab because like this is the greatest joke ever. And so I was in his office, or in his lab a week later. And at the end of that day, I was like, well, it looks like I'm going to leave my current job and try to go figure out biology with George.
Well, Ben, one of the big takeaways there, I think, for us is just the breadth of companies that you've sort of founded and exited. A lot of people spend their whole lives just focusing on one particular field and trying to build a successful company across the span of a lifetime. You've managed to build many across multiple fields: education, defense, now de-extinction. What have you learned about entrepreneurship and about you as a founder over that period of time?
That's a great question. I've learned that I'm really curious, and sometimes that's really painful. So I find things interesting and I want to work on them. And then there's days where I'm like, it may be easier to work on something that isn't as hard, but I just like interesting challenges, right? I like to learn, and I've been very, very fortunate. Interestingly, today that we're having this conversation, Ariana Husili, who's our head of biological sciences and our Mammoth lead, she was elected to Time 100, right? And so I get to work with people like that, right? And so for me, being able to talk to, Andrew Pask and George Church and Beth Shapiro and all these industry luminaries is just really fascinating. And so I found about myself, I don't sit still well. And I also find that when I get curious and I get passionate about something, I just kind of go all in. But the flip side is, entrepreneurship's hard and it's painful, and there's many more bad days than good in a lot of ways. But, overall, I've just been very, very fortunate kind of to learn along the journey.
Well, Ben, you said there it may be interesting to work on something that isn't as hard. And I think that's a good lead into the work you're doing at Colossal Biosciences, because you may have picked the absolute hardest field to go into, and that is de-extinction. And now to lead us off, I'm sure you've been asked this question before, but have you seen Jurassic Park?
Yes. Yeah. No, that's amazing. You breaking new ground here. It's like I just made it my ringtone because it's easier at this point. Interestingly enough, on the Jurassic Park question, a lot of people ask me if I've seen it, which I have. A lot of people ask me if I know how it ended. I do. It was also a movie. But what we're doing is, so two interesting things about Jurassic Park, or lots of interesting things, but two interesting as it relates to Colossal. A lot of people think that we were inspired by Jurassic Park. I would actually argue that Jurassic Park was inspired by us. And what I mean by that is, in Michael Crichton's original book, there is a DNA sequence in it, which is a very slightly modified version of one of George Church's first published genome sequences. And so George, I would argue, inspired Michael Crichton to write the book. Wow. So I would argue that if any, we do not get royalties on Jurassic Park, but I would argue that George was fundamental in that, in kind of pushing this whole field forward, right? And it's crazy to see the two, because you're like, wow, that's virtually the same thing. And then secondly, I like to think of what we're doing as like reverse Jurassic Park. And so like Jurassic Park was like taking, DNA from dinosaurs, from amber, which, by the way, you cannot get DNA from amber. Not that we've tried. I'm just stating a fact that, and then filling in the holes, if you will, with this frog DNA, right? This African frog DNA. With Colossal, we're almost doing the exact opposite, right? Like, we're using the genetic code in the case of like the mammoth of the Asian elephant that we know produced an elephant because we took the samples from an elephant. And then we're using computational analysis with ancient DNA to understand what the genes were that made a mammoth, and then engineering them into that code that we already know works. So we're not trying to fill in the mammoth holes in that fragmented DNA. We're really trying to engineer in the mammoth genes into the architecture that we know produces an elephant.
It's fascinating, and there's so many questions that we want to unpack, like why and how and stuff like that. But I think just for people that are new to this story and is trying to get their head around it, it would be great to hear the story from that first phone call with George Church. He leaves you with that thought and then hangs up, and you're reflecting on it. Tell us the story from there. How did it go from that initial conversation to founding Colossal Biosciences to where it is today?
Yeah. So a week later, I called him back the next day, and a week later I was in the lab, spent some time with them in the lab. And, I think part of it was him, sussing me out. I was kind of feeling him out. We seem to be very, very similar aligned. George, my tagline at Hypergiant, like our registered trademark, was tomorrowing today. And towards the end of the meeting, George was like, this is George Church saying about himself, not me. George's like, I feel like I'm from the future, and I'm just trying to have today catch up to the future. And I was like, well, that's our tagline. We could not be more philosophically aligned on everything. We're both very collaborative. I built a lot of tech and open source software, and he believes in open source. Like we just philosophically see the world a lot of the same ways. And so we got pretty excited. I was like, okay, cool. Now I got to go resign from the company I'm the founder and CEO of, and figured this out. And then, so I go back to Texas, start mapping this out. I was like, we're going to call it Mammoth. And then I was like, Disney owns mammoth.com. That's going to be hard. And what if we do stuff more than Disney? Started like thinking about naming and like how to do this. And then I'm a big trust but verify guy. So I ended up actually, I hope if George listens to this, I hope he still loves me afterwards. I did hire external scientists and talk to a lot of other scientists. And what was interesting is most roads led back to George. Like we talked to a scientist that's incredible and actually now on our scientific advisory board. And they were like, yeah, you know who could do this? George Church. And it's like, and like, it was like those clips from like a movie. It's like George Church. So it all roads led back to George. And so I felt excited about it. And then this small pandemic hit, and we didn't work on it for a little bit because we were going to build a company that required people in a lab when people weren't allowed to go into the same building. So it kind of derailed like we got really excited, and then like we lost a little momentum due to the pandemic. And then coming out of the pandemic, I went and found a CEO to replace me at Hypergiant. Great guy, big seasoned exec that took over my role to help continue to scale the business. And then I was off to do this with George. I will say the first handful of investor meetings didn't go great. They're like, so wait, your business plan is you don't have an agreement with Harvard. George is not full-time. He's like part-time, even though I would argue that we get more of George's time than arguably anyone because he's just so passionate about it. You have no scientists on your team, and none of you guys have a background in biology. And your answer to our monetization question is, yeah, we're going to make a mammoth, and we're pretty sure that's valuable in a lot of different ways. We just haven't figured it out. And one of my co-founders like built 3 businesses with me. One of my other co-founders, had taken companies public for billions of dollars. It's like we can figure this out. And the first couple of meetings didn't go great. They were like, you guys have lost your minds. And we're like, no, there's a technology infrastructure here that we think is really interesting. There's opportunities with governments and carbon credits. We didn't know. We were just talking about what we thought the art of the possible could be. And, the first handful of investor meetings went pretty poorly. And then, fast forward to now, we then took a step back and we said, we really need to go meet with long-term, really smart technology investors, right? And so we reached out to Thomas Tall, we reached out to Jim Breyer, reached out to Tim Draper and a few others. And, I ended up I was in Pittsburgh at Thomas's house, and Tom was like, this is one of the most important companies that could ever exist. Like, we need infrastructure that with the number of species we're going to lose, like what happens if, we don't have the technologies to bring these species back and we have ecosystem collapse. And so we started to, I think, be really thoughtful about who we brought to the table. And Thomas and Jim and others supported us early on, and then that kind of gave us the traction to just go. And fast forward to now, we now have 4 labs. We've got 114 people. We've got a 60-person scientific and executive advisory board, and we've got 30 postdocs we fund all over the world, including 15 there in Australia. And we're working now on the mammoth, the thylacine, and the dodo. And yeah, it's going much better than it started.
Well, Ben, I guess before like the answering the what, how do we monetize, and apart from it being just a really interesting concept to work on, the big question is why. Like, why is de-extinction important? Why has this taken your focus away from what you were working on? What are the benefits of bringing back the woolly mammoth, the Tasmanian tiger, the dodo? What is this? What's the fundamental problem that you're solving here? The why?
We thought there was a really great opportunity with Colossal to build a company that had a lot of economic value and built value for our shareholders, while also making an impact to the world. And then if we do it the right way and we're transparent and we're ethical and we try to, be as inclusive as possible along the journey, hopefully we can also inspire, right? Like I've seen a lot of people that have been inspired by the, SpaceX and Blue Origin and kind of NASA journey, right? Like there's like being a part of these like literal moonshots is pretty interesting. And, hopefully someone else does something much better and cooler than we did because of, our grit and work and hopefully long-term success here. But fundamentally, we're going to lose up to 50% of all biodiversity between now and 2050 if we don't do anything. And, man-made climate change and, just all of the choices that we are making on this planet are having a causality effect around the world. And Australia obviously is, currently kind of leading in mammalian, extinction rates, right? And we're seeing that in the wildfires. We're seeing that with invasive species, with cats and other species around the world. And so for us, if we can use de-extinction as our way to build a toolkit that we can monetize in a lot of different ways, which I guess we'll talk about in a minute, while subsidizing those same technologies or variants of those technologies for conservation, and give conservation new tools in the fight against loss of biodiversity. It seems interesting economically. It seems interesting from an impact perspective. And so the opportunity to go build something and apply mine and other people much smarter than me as a skill set to these challenges it was like, you say we talked about my journey earlier, you say as an entrepreneur, at least I've said it as 100 times or probably more, oh, I want to do this and it's going to change the world. Like at least tech entrepreneurs in America say that. That's part of like what they teach us or put in the Kool-Aid. And but most of those companies don't. Most of those companies like just use more compute power and shit and going to get bought by someone who ruins it. That's kind of what happens. And so when you're presented this opportunity as an entrepreneur that's said those words, you're pretty disingenuous if you kind of get an opportunity to step up to the plate and you don't swing. And so I felt like, this is really George's idea, and I feel like I just get to be a partner and be a steward of that idea. But I feel like, if it all fails, I could just go make more software. And this was an opportunity I felt to do something that we believe really matters. And hopefully we can arm conservationists and governments with new technologies that could be at least, not solve the biodiversity loss crisis, but maybe be one bullet in the war against it.
So Ben, let's drill down on this question of why, because there's an interesting climate change angle. So I'd love for you to unpack it. The story of the woolly mammoth, reintroducing the woolly mammoth to the Arctic tundra, and how that might help in the world's fight against climate change. If you could unpack that mechanism a little bit, that would be great.
Yeah, so there's, in all the species that we're working on, we look at what is the ecosystem balance or ecological void that's being solved. Obviously, we can talk about thylacine in a minute. Talk about the dodo. They also have different problems, right? None of them independently are going to cure and combat climate change, but they can play their role. And what's interesting with George, when we started this project, was George had been working with scientists in Siberia and in Cambridge and others in the Arctic and tundra research groups, looking at what is the impact of rewilding cold tolerant megafauna at the right density models back into the tundra, into the taiga forest. And what they found, which I thought is really fascinating, and it's shown up in now I think 9 or 10 peer-reviewed papers, scientific papers, is that with the reintroduction of these species, coupled with the removal of these carnivorous trees, these taiga trees, which are very low carbon yielding, they've got this dark bark, they permeate the soil, they're kind of almost like heat lightning rods. And if you remove those and you get the right density of megafauna, of cold tolerant megafauna back in the area, you can lower ground temperatures by up to 8 degrees. And they've proven this over decades. And the reason why, and then I'll tell you why that group as well as others and George have modeled that mammoths can be accelerant to it, is you get this like compounding effect. The Arctic grasslands had about a sixth, the grasses comparative to the taiga forest is about 6 times more efficient at carbon storage in the root structure than the taiga forest. It also is about 2 to 3 times more efficient at what's called the albedo effect, so the radiation light reflection coefficient back into space that isn't absorbed into the grasses. And interestingly enough, in the winter months, those herding animals in the winter months, they actually help pack the snow so that the temperatures of those cold winds that really drive the temperatures on the ground aren't hitting that insulated warming effect of that fluffy snow layer. They're actually getting closer to the ground and lowering temperature. So in the summer months, when the permafrost starts to thaw naturally, it starts off about 8 degrees colder, right? And we've all been talking about the 1.5 degree tipping point, and why that's important. And then in the summer months, they're just great at eating and defecating and spreading spreading those grasses. And what's interesting about elephants specifically, there's a paper that came out last year or the year and a half ago around forest elephants, and how forest elephants are one of the most important environmental modifiers and climate protectors on the planet, because they just instinctually know what tree they love knocking down trees. And when Colossal does not have a war on trees, we just want to support elephants that seem to be much smarter at which trees knock down than us. But they, in all these peer-reviewed papers, they've shown that elephants actually know which trees to knock down, and the African forest elephant knocks down these low carbon yielding trees and supports the trees that are better for the environment. It's just crazy what nature does. And so take that and you look at kind of these natural bulldozers of the taiga forest, and you look at kind of all the benefits of that. If we can get to a point where even if we can't lower ground temperatures by 8 degrees, but even north of 1.5, it will be very helpful, because there's more carbon and more methane stored in the Arctic Circle than anywhere else on Earth. It's about double what's in the atmosphere, and methane's about 30 times worse than carbon in the atmosphere. So if the permafrost melts, and just to be clear, Colossal is not going to stop the permafrost melting. We believe that we can help build a richer Pleistocene ecosystem and help rejuvenate it and play a part in it. But a lot more people need to be thinking about the permafrost melting, because if the permafrost melts, and I've been there, we got a bigger problem than a lot of things.
It's sad the extremes that we have to go to fight climate change.
Bringing a mammoth back.
Well, but this is in nature. But here's the beauty. This is kind of like it's a halo effect, right? It's like if we are successful on our mammoth pursuit and other Arctic rewilding pursuits, then we can help replenish that ecosystem. We've seen rewilding work across the world, like Yellowstone and many other locations. And nature's pretty good at this. And there was a paper that came out a couple months ago talking about the effects of 9 species, elephants being one, that these 9 species, if there were more of them and we protected them, they would that their impact to the ecosystem and its restorative properties, as well as the carbon sinks themselves, would offset the same amount of carbon as all cars. So we actually can find a balance with nature if we work with nature. It's not like people are like, oh, we just have to go home and use solar power and turn off everything and never use a car again. I don't believe that. I think that there are alternatives to kind of this like ecosystem life balance that just needs to exist. And so I don't even look at it as extreme. I just think it's bringing attention to these areas that if we could collaborate better with nature, I think a lot of this stuff will get sorted out.
I'm interested to ask you a question around, I guess the moral hazard of this technology, because like it's so exciting, and the opportunity not just for the woolly mammoth and the Tasmanian tiger and the like, but as you've mentioned, the biodiversity loss that the world's already seen and is projected to continue seeing is pretty staggering, and any opportunity to bring it back is really exciting. How do you think about the way that success for you would change people's behavior? Like, do you think it would lead to less conservation efforts because, your technology sort of acts as a backstop? Or how do you think about the implications of this if you're successful?
Yeah, it's a great point and thoughtful question that, we spend a lot of time with our bioethicists and our conservation board talking about. But, bringing back an extinct species is not cheap. It is expensive. Like, we raised $225 million US. Like that's not, that's $225 million US. It's exactly what it is. So this is very hard and it's very expensive, and we can't bring back, every species. I had a similar question the other day where someone asked, if we bring back the Tassie tiger, will the Australian and Tasmanians, they won't really learn from their mistakes. So like, well, most people that killed them are dead. And I think that doesn't mean that we can't learn from the sins of the past by making better choices in the future. And so I would rather, I'm more of an eternal optimist than pessimist. And so I don't really believe in a lot of these dystopian narratives that we are being fed. And so, I personally believe that it's better to have the technologies and be able to leverage them in ways to help species like the northern white rhino or others, than to not have them when you absolutely need them. So I'd rather have them than not need them. I think that de-extinction on a global scale is cost prohibitive, right? Like, maybe long-term Colossal does a handful of species, but I think what is probably more likely a bigger impact is that the technologies Colossal develops outside of its application to human healthcare, the technology that it develops that has an application to conservation. I think nonprofits and NGOs and governments start using those technologies in their own regard. And so we have a plan that we've been very open with, that any technology application that we have for conservation, people can use for free, right? And so we can't solve everything. It's not our technology. It's more about how do we empower those other conservation groups. And so, I don't think it gives us as humanity an excuse not to be good stewards of it, because, if we take that attitude, it's technology and cost prohibitive. We can't bring everything back.
So Ben, you mentioned there you'd raised $225 million, and we are a business podcast. So on the other side of this break, I want to pick up the fundraising journey to date and what it's been like. So we're here with Ben Lamm from Colossal Biosciences. So Ben, we're a business podcast here, so we'd love to get into the numbers a bit. You mentioned $225 million is what you've raised so far. And you also mentioned that when you were originally talking to investors, the answer of how we're going to make money from this was one that I guess you didn't have an answer for, so to speak. So how has that process gone? How are you telling investors now that you'll make money? Is it a case of, this idea is so wild and large that people just want to be part of the journey? Talk us through that sort of, raising process.
I think that, like, for us, we look at it more akin to like the Apollo program, right? Going back to this whole NASA model. And fundamentally, we believe that the technology spinoffs that came from that literal moonshot have changed history. Like, some of the fundamental technologies developed for that allow us to have this podcast, right? It's amazing, right? Some people just think about like Velcro and Tang, which are great, but there's been a lot of other great stuff that came, from the Apollo program, right? And so we look at the same, right? And so for us, on the path to de-extinction, it is a systems problem, right? So coming from a software world, I try to think those terms and in those mindsets. And so we cannot be successful in our efforts unless we solve hard software problems, hard wetware lab problems, and hard physical device problems and hardware. And so when you look at things in a systems approach, typically the pieces from that have absolute impact to other industries. And so we've already seen that. So we spun out a technology company last year. Foreign Bio is our first company that we spun out, and it is a computational biology platform that leverages AI to do that kind of bridges the gap between bench scientists and computational biology cores. So we believe that we're shortening the time to discovery, and we spun it out and raised an oversubscribed $35 million round. It's worth 9 figures and growing, right? So all of our early investors get equity, or all of our investors get equity in that at the time of spin out. And that's something that we've created tremendous shareholder value in a very short period of time. We are innovating at such a fast clip that the biggest thing that we're spending a lot of time on is thinking about when to spin out, when to JV, when to license tech. We are also given this incredible network of scientists. We have incredible people from all over the world at tier 1 universities and others that are bringing us IP and ideas, right? People that maybe couldn't have gotten funding because they didn't have the business plan, but have really great science. So we're not ready to announce anything yet, but we are working on a directed evolution partnership with a company that we're partially gestating in Colossal right now that we think has massive applications to climate and other areas. And so we're looking at leveraging kind of the infrastructure and technology that we're developing here and putting them into JVs as well as these direct spin outs. And so that technology incubation, is fundamental to our approach to this. Like, multiplex editing as most diseases are multi disease states, require a multi-gene solution. Very few are single gene sourced, right? And so we are arguably one of the companies in the world that's advancing multiplex editing and be able to edit at multiple parts of the genome at the same time with causing minimum off-target effects. That's something that we're seeing, that we're developing at Colossal, right? And so that alone, and that the suite of technologies alone on that, could be massively transformative to human healthcare. So when you take that and then you also look at the opportunities with governments around the world and biobanking and species preservation and carbon credits and biodiversity credits, we really think there's an opportunity to build a big technology business, a big government business, and beyond. And those are just where we're starting. And so when you start to really look at the math, a couple of multi-billion-dollar, shots on goal that come out of the company, hundreds of millions of dollars from, biodiversity and carbon credits to eventually billions long term with these kind of like, self-replicating assets. It seems interesting, right? And so outside of the halo effect of these academic institutions that are now bringing us technologies to collaborate on. So it's definitely a non-traditional business model. It's also a new category, right? Like no one's really succeeded yet in de-extinction to our knowledge. So it's an entire new category that we're trying to navigate the best way we know how.
Well, Ben, I think your comment there, seems interesting, is probably the understatement of this interview. It is absolutely fascinating what you guys are working on. I want to close out with 2 questions about the future, one about the more short-term future and then one longer-term future. So the first, more short-term, when we were researching for this episode, we saw that when you first announced Colossal and in early press, you and George were talking about 2027 as the date that you thought woolly mammoths would be reintroduced to the Arctic tundra. Are we still on? 4 years isn't that long.
Yes, trust me. 4 years is not that long. Yeah. I don't know if we said reintroduce. I think we said birth, because it's about 22. There is a 22-month gestation. I will say, though, we just announced a partnership with North Dakota State here in the U.S., one of our northernmost states, obviously excluding Alaska. We're also working with the Alaskan government and people as well. But we just announced a partnership with Alaska, and they actually the state invested in the company. So they have kind of this vested interest in our success. We're working with them on what different rewilding models look like for mammoths and other species. And so I think that the rewilding efforts will take longer. It takes about 6 years, I think, for calves. We're working with a lot of groups in elephant nonprofits and orphaned elephants in Africa. So we're looking at different models for rewilding. We think it'll be about 6 years post-birth before we can start really rewilding. And we're on target. I think 2027, maybe December 31st could be possible. We are looking at 2028. We feel really confident about that 2028 goal. All of the necessary parts of the project and parts of the system we've parallel pathed, and so we've got different stages of development. Not just this isn't a linear development process, but we're in the editing phase. So we feel confident in that kind of like 2028 timeframe, maybe a little later, maybe a little sooner. But that's still very much in the realm of possibility. I will say it will probably not be the first species, just because it's got a 22-month gestation, and some of the other breakthroughs we've had recently may lead to other species coming sooner.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Well, Ben, we like to always finish conversations with CEOs when talking about, I guess, what long-term success would look like. If you are able to achieve everything that you want to achieve and build the company, or companies now, we should say, given that you've had one spin out and it sounds like there might be more. But if you're able to sort of achieve everything that you want to achieve, looking back in 20 or 30 years, what would success look like for you?
People are like, oh my gosh, if I saw a Tassie tiger or a thylacine, it'd be just amazing. They're like, it'd just be amazing. And I don't want it ever not to be amazing, because I think nature's pretty cool, right? Like, elephants are cool. If you go see an elephant, it's pretty damn cool. It's amazing. But maybe if it's not magical, like right now, I'd say it's magical. You saw a thylacine or a dodo or a mammoth, you'd be like, wow, that's not just amazing. That's unbelievable. That's magical, right? If I would like for us to be so successful that like mammoths are just a thing. They're just a thing in the ecosystem. They're just like, they're still great and amazing, like elephants are amazing, or like rhinos are amazing, or like cheetahs are amazing, but they're not like, oh my gosh, like, it's the most insane thing, because we were so successful in not just the de-extinction but also the population genomics in building sustainable herds. Same thing with the Tassie tiger, where it's like, it's no longer this like Bigfoot-esque blurry photo thing in the Australian culture. Like, oh my gosh, I saw a picture of something but I didn't get a good picture of it. It's like the UAP of marsupials over there. And our phones just don't work around aliens and thylacines and Bigfoot. Those are the three. I don't know what deal they've cut with Apple, but I think success means that like, it's just part of life again, and it's not magical. And so if we can make it not magical because there's enough thriving populations, I think that's success.
Well, Ben, that is a crazy thought to end the interview with. I hope in 20 years that we are walking around just
very blasé
about the fact that there's mammoths hanging out. That'd be epic. Well, we wish you all the best with it, and we'll be following very, very closely. And I'm so glad we've had the opportunity to speak with you today. No doubt there are plenty of Equity Mates community members listening who have been very fascinated in your story. So all the best with it, and thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So Equity Mates, as Ben just said, he will be here in Australia for the South by Southwest conference. If you're interested in seeing him, plus many other thinkers, creators, and innovators from around the world, head to the link in the show notes to grab a ticket. It is a week-long event from October 15 through to October 22. Huge program, people from all over the world. It's an opportunity for startup pitches, networking, they say mind-bending activations in technology, showcasing future trends, Ren.
Wow, maybe there'll be a Woolly Mammoth exhibition.
That would be awesome. But anyway, head to southbysouthwest.com. That is sxswsydney.com. And we'll see you there.
You have been listening to an Equity Mates Media production. In the spirit of reconciliation, Equity Mates Media acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. This podcast is intended for education and entertainment purposes. Any advice is general advice only and has not taken into account your personal financial circumstances, needs, or objectives. Before acting on general advice, you should consider if it is relevant to your needs and read the relevant product disclosure statement. And if you're unsure, please speak to a financial professional. The hosts of this podcast and their guests may have positions in the companies mentioned. Equity Mates Media operates under an Australian Financial Services Licence 540697.